So I'll discuss briefly on industrial animal agriculture and its effect on climate change. And then I'll show how traditional knowledge actually embodies One Health principles. And then I'll look at how traditional knowledge has ingrained animal welfare principles, and we'll chart a path forward that bridges the two concepts together. So I put a few images on the screen that reflect what animal agriculture looked like in the past. So in the past, we had a lot of small-scale animal agriculture, and so animals had enough space to roam, enough space to actually exhibit their natural behavior. And this has been overtaken by the present, which is what you have on the screen right now. Apologies for the very gruesome images, but this is actually the reality of animal agriculture in the world today. So we have large-scale industrialized animal agriculture, and the big goal behind this particular form of animal agriculture is to drive as much productivity from the animals without caring for their welfare or their concerns in any way, shape, and form. So obviously, with this kind of animal agriculture, it has effects on the environment, and many people do not realize the effects it has on the environment. So the effects of animal agriculture on the environment, especially on climate change, is often overlooked, not only in conversations in Africa, but also beyond. So we're going to look at the effects in two ways. There's the direct effects and the indirect effects. So the direct effects have to do with the effect on greenhouse gases. So these direct greenhouse gases are affected by animal agriculture through the natural process of enteric fermentation and manure management. So based on studies which have been done, 14.5% of global GHG emissions come from livestock production. So when we say GHG emissions, it's gases such as methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. So this comes through enteric fermentation, which is basically a natural process where microorganisms within the animal break down food and other products into the gases that I had just mentioned. So 14.5% of GHG gases actually come from animal effects. And then we also have indirect effects. So to be able to manage and have a large-scale animal agriculture field, there needs to be a lot of feeds. So feed production actually accounts for around 45% of livestock-related emissions. So a lot of energy is taken into production of feeds to be able to have this large-scale animal agriculture as we see it today. And then there's also the effect from land use change. So in the past, things such as forests are taken down to be able to actually accommodate this large-scale farming. And this disrupts certain things such as the natural carbon cycle. So for example, in the past, forests which actually sequester a lot of carbon than, for example, croplands or pastures, once they are cut down, this releases a lot of carbon into the atmosphere when they are cleared for agriculture. And currently, agricultural land amounts for around 38% of the global land surface, and 2/3 of this is used for animal livestock. So definitely, it's impossible for us to separate the conversation on climate change with the conversation of animal agriculture. So it's important for us to not divorce these two concepts together. So now that we've seen the effects of animal agriculture on climate change, I'd like us to consider the benefit that traditional knowledge can give us in this animal welfare era. And by traditional knowledge, I basically refer to, some people refer to it as indigenous knowledge, but it's basically knowledge, innovations, practices of indigenous people. This was transmitted mostly orally from generations to generations. And unlike today, where intellectual property is owned by individuals or corporates, traditional knowledge was communally owned. So it was collectively owned, and it was transmitted through things such as songs, folklores, oral laws, myths, beliefs, rituals, and all of that. So traditional knowledge is actually one of the most underrated kind of knowledge in the world today. And I'm trying to show that traditional knowledge reflects One Health principles, and I'll show that in the next slide. But even before that, for those who don't know what One Health is, or didn't have a chance to join the presentation just before lunch, One Health is a relatively new concept in the research field that considers the interconnectedness between animal health, environmental health, and human health. So it is deeply rooted in indigenous views of health, and it considers that it's impossible to separate the health of humans with the health of animals and the environment. So they are all considered together. So many people see that, initially people think that One Health it's traced to the Greek philosopher Hippocrates, but as you'll see, One Health is a concept that is there in indigenous knowledge and has been there for a long time. So traditional knowledge embodies certain One Health principles. So for example, traditional knowledge saw health as something holistic. So well-being was considered from all kinds of angles: the well-being of humans, the well-being of animals, soil, water, and spirit. So in many indigenous communities, health was not just the absence of the disease, but it was kind of this state of balance between humans, animals, and the environment. So this holistic approach aligns very closely with what we consider One Health to be right now, but even goes further to incorporate elements such as spiritual health, that One Health, which is considered a generally Western framework, often overlooks. So one thing that traditional knowledge did very well that One Health also tries to incorporate is understanding that well-being was something that was co-created. It wasn't, there was an ecological balance and respectful interdependence between all kinds of beings. So for example, if a river was sick or it was polluted, the people and animals who depended on that river would also be unwell. So they recognized that it was impossible to separate the health of the environment, such as the river, with the health of those who really depend on it, such as animals and humans. Another good example is if animal populations were declining or animals were behaving abnormally, this was seen as an early warning of a broader ecological imbalance. And this understanding of this warning of an ecological imbalance is reflected in modern day epidemiology and conservation science, which are only catching up to these long-held insights. So they did this through the enacting of spiritual and moral codes that guided the treatment of animal and nature. So the whole goal behind traditional knowledge was ecological interdependence, so the balance between humans, animals, and the environment. And they understood that the disruption of that unit would disrupt them all. So traditional knowledge really embodies One Health as we consider it today. And the fact that it does embody One Health leads to my next part of the presentation, which is on traditional knowledge and animal welfare. So there is a common understanding that One Health is in the best interests for the animal or promotes animal welfare. And we'll see how traditional knowledge just actually promotes animal welfare as well. And I'll be touching on certain things that were touched on in the opening session for those who attended. And we basically are going to see how traditional communities promoted animal welfare in a way that we can see how to adopt it today. So there was the consideration of animals as kin or sacred beings. So they were viewed not just as commodities, which modern industrial animal agriculture does today. There's the over-commodification of animals and seeing them just as a commodity as opposed to something that's sacred. So animals in some communities were considered as relatives, as spirit beings, and this was seen in examples such as of totems. So if you had a totem animal, you could never harm it. So if your totem was a rhino or a snake, you could not harm your totem animal because they believed there was a spiritual link between you and your totem animal. They also had, some communities actually even named their domestic animals. They shared food with them. For example, if you joined Aurelia's session earlier, she was mentioning her grandmother and how her first thing when she wakes up in the morning is to think about has she opened her chickens to go and eat. They were included in community life, they were included in practices, and there were huge emotional bonds between animals and humans. So they were not seen just as property, but they were seen as part of the community, so there was a relationship of respect and strong emotional bond. In addition to that, there was ethical treatment guided by culture. So cruelty, which is something that we are actively trying to avoid and prevent, was discouraged through things such as oral teachings, taboos, rituals, customary laws. So they would consider that being cruel to animals was, like for example, if you hurt a certain animal, something would happen to you. So cruelty was discouraged, not by written laws as we have them today, but some of these taboos and rituals actively discouraged cruelty. And in cases of communities who consumed animals, killing was, first of all, minimized. So it wasn't an everyday event, the way we see animals constantly being killed in today's modern world. And it was always with a purpose, and the methods which were used were designed to reduce suffering. So there was this embodiment of ethical treatment and the discouragement of cruelty. Additionally, there was the respect for autonomy and freedom. So this was especially seen with wild animals. They were rarely confined. So things such as zoos were not commonplace. Their autonomy was respected, and like we saw in the opening session, there was a really good relationship and a really good coexistence, even with wild animals. So for example, in Kenya, if you go to the Masai Mara, for those who are not from Kenya, you'll find the Masai communities. They walk, they pass the lions, they pass all these kind of animals, and then nothing will happen to you. But if you try get out of your van and be with these animals, I don't think the same thing would happen. So this coexistence was respected, and wildlife thrived in community managed corridors and ecosystems. And there was also a non-extractive worldview. So animals were not counted as assets in a commodified way. So if you join the open session, there was the example of not actually counting animals. They knew animals as the individuals, and their practices prioritize harmony over exploitation. So in terms of a way forward, I think it's important to bridge these two concepts together and marry them together. So one way we can do this is to incorporate traditional knowledge into animal welfare training and interventions. I think there are so many important health knowledge which has been there since the past, and we can't be able to see how to include it into animal welfare interventions. This also creates the opportunity of having buy-in from the people who we are trying to get to care more about animal welfare. There's also the promotion of a non-industrial indigenous food systems. So we need to support farming methods which are not about the over-commodification of animals, and that support this respect for animal welfare and ecological balance. So if it's the use of community gardens, plant-based food initiatives, these things we can all work together to promote this non-industrial food system. And more importantly, there needs to be funding of oral knowledge preservation and sharing. We have lost a lot of indigenous knowledge, unfortunately, so this needs a lot of time to look at the archives, to speak to people like elders who actually hold this traditional knowledge, and that takes a lot of resources that we need. So the goal is to have a way in which communities can preserve their heritage while still advancing animal welfare and climate resilience through culturally grounded practical actions. Thank you.